We all knew that cruises would be drastically different when they return. Just like we've seen everywhere from restaurants to movie theaters to shopping malls, the normal way of doing things has been turned on its head. Now masks and social distancing are commonplace when just a year ago they were largely unheard of. To combat this health crisis, the world has simply had to change. Now that the CDC has let the no sail order expire, replacing it instead with a pathway to return to sailing, it is also requiring cruise lines to make drastic changes if they want to sail again. Of course, many of these changes are ones we'd all expect. It includes things like face masks and social distancing, but within the 40-page framework for conditional sailing are dozens of steps that cruise lines must take in order to sail again from the United States. These big new rules and policies can be major, but it's what has to happen for cruises to resume safely. A cruise ship needing a certification from the Coast Guard doesn't seem out of the ordinary, but what about a certificate from the CDC to sail again? No one would have guessed that just a year ago. That's exactly what's needed according to the framework laid out by the agency. Technically called a Conditional Sailing Certificate, the CDC now requires cruise ships be certified before sailing again. A cruise ship operator shall not commence or continue any passenger operations in U.S. waters without a COVID-19 Conditional Sailing Certificate issued by the CDC, the order laying out the framework says. This certificate is granted only after cruise lines meet a number of requirements, which we'll get into later on, and complete an application. Even after it is granted, cruise lines must continue to be in compliance or risk losing their certificate and the ability to sail. One of the first steps in the path back to sailing is that cruise lines must implement weekly testing of their crew on the ship. From the order, laboratory testing for every crew member must be conducted on a weekly basis or at such other intervals as required by CDC in technical instructions and orders. Quote, CDC may conduct oversight of specimen collection, testing, and laboratory procedures as necessary. Now, putting regular testing in place for the crew represents a solid foundation for a return to sailing. The crew, which stays on the ship as passengers come and go, must be healthy if there is any consideration of keeping all the passengers healthy as well. A week-long cruise is a classic staple of sailing, and thankfully with the new CDC rules, it's still allowed. However, longer trips are not in the cards right now. In the guidelines laid out is a rule that cruise lines cannot sail or even offer to sail a trip longer than 7 days. The rules go on to say that the CDC may change the number of days allowed based on, quote, public health considerations. So in theory, this rule could be lifted if the COVID situation improves. Some cruise lines, they've already stopped offering sailings in more than a week, and others are likely to in the near future. Now, what's not clear is if passengers are allowed to book back-to-back cruises, thereby staying on a ship or ships for longer than 7 consecutive days. By far, the biggest step that cruise lines are taking to ensure the health of everyone on the ship is universal testing. The industry as a whole committed to 100% testing of passengers before they board. While that doesn't ensure no one on the ship won't have COVID, after all, even complete testing could miss cases or have cases appear days after someone tests negative. It is a major step. The CDC, however, is taking things even further. It requires cruise lines to test passengers and crew on embarkation day before they are allowed to board. Cruise lines prior, they had mentioned having a test within a few days of boarding. As well, the CDC requires lines to test passengers and crew leaving the ship on the day of disembarkation as well. So each passenger will have at least 2 tests on their cruise. There's no word yet on the logistics of testing the entire ship before they're allowed to leave, but it could end up taking longer to get off the ship if waiting on results. While the CDC is taking a big step in overseeing cruise lines' return, there are a number of other authorities required to sign off on a ship's return. Notably, the CDC is requiring cruise lines to have signed agreements in place with ports and local health authorities. These agreements include a medical care agreement between the cruise line and healthcare entities that cover taking passengers and crew needing medical attention to local hospitals. As well, a housing agreement must be signed between the cruise line and a facility on land to isolate COVID cases. Finally, an agreement between the cruise line and port must be in place to determine how many ships may operate at a port so as not to overburden the area should there be cases on a cruise. Now, one of the most interesting new requirements is that cruise lines wanting to sail in the United States must complete something called a simulated voyage first. These trips, they're exactly what they sound like. They're practice cruises that give the crew a chance to do a dry run on new procedures before paying passengers return. The simulated voyages will have volunteer passengers that are at least 18 years old. These passengers must not have had any prior medical conditions that put them in a higher risk group for COVID. The practice cruises must mimic a real trip, including embarkation and debarkation procedures, activities like dining and entertainment, and even shore excursions. On board, the cruise line must put in place the policies it will have on real cruises, including social distancing, face mask rules, and testing of passengers for the virus. The new rules from the CDC for the cruise lines don't just have to do with what's happening on board the ship. Even cruise line marketing has to get an adjustment. Buried within the framework is a rule that, quote, the cruise ship operator must, in marketing materials, on its website, and in offering voyages, notify prospective passengers prior to accepting a reservation of any CDC travel advisory, warning, or recommendation relating to cruise travel. Currently, that advisory says for passengers to defer all cruise travel. Now, whether or not posting this sort of advisory will impact potential cruisers has yet to be seen. Given the pandemic, however, having passengers have all the information from authorities is important. So what happens if a case of COVID does find its way onto a cruise ship? One of the possibilities of the Healthy Sail panel was that if there were a small number of cases detected on the ship, then those passengers testing positive, they could be isolated and the cruise could continue. The CDC framework states that, quote, if a threshold of COVID-19 is detected on board the cruise ship during a voyage, the voyage will be ended immediately and the ship returned to the U.S. port of embarkation. On the way home, sick passengers or crew are to be isolated while other passengers are quarantined. As well, future trips on the ship will be canceled until allowed to resume by the agency. Now, we've contacted the CDC to find out exactly what the threshold number of cases to end a cruise is, but they told us that it will be outlined in the future. Obviously, the CDC hopes to avoid what we saw before the cruise suspension, where cases on a ship increased as passengers stayed on board and interacted. So what happens after a case is found on the ship and passengers return to port? Letting them all go their separate ways home could lead to lots of contacts between potentially at-risk passengers and the traveling public. In the instance that there is a threshold of cases, the rules state that passengers on the ship are to use, quote, non-commercial transportation or other transportation, close quote, to get back home. If someone drove to the port and can simply walk to their car, that doesn't seem to be a big issue. However, in places like Miami, where many passengers fly in for their cruise, it's yet to be determined exactly how all those passengers will get back home. It would be difficult and expensive to charter private aircraft for all passengers who flew to the port. The CDC now also requires cruise lines to disclose to passengers in marketing materials that if there are cases on their cruise, quote, their subsequent travel, including their return home, may be restricted or delayed. If a new crew member is coming onto the ship from land, then they must not only be tested for the virus, but also quarantine on board for 14 days, no matter if they tested negative. This allows time just in case the virus is incubating before becoming traceable. If a crew member tests positive when boarding, they must be isolated until the CDC guidelines for ending the isolation are met. Either way, crew heading to the ship when cruise lines begin to ramp up the staff in anticipation of a return look to be in for a long wait before they can get to work. Along with these changes, passengers are going to face lots of other adjustments, just as they have on land. In other words, cruises are undergoing the most drastic change in their history, at least until the crisis is over. So with all these changes, would you still sail? Do they turn you off of cruising? Let us know in the comments below. As well, be sure to like and subscribe and check out our channel for more videos.